Chapter 7, 1968 to 1969. The school bus. In Sacramento, we spotted it. A short, rusted, orange school bus beside a stucco house with a broken window and scattered evidence of kids. As we turned into a dirt driveway, a muscular man with the beginnings of a beard came out of the house, followed by a long line of whooping kids and their fat mama yelling for them to settle down. The man and Charlie hit it off right away, and they began discussing a trade. He said his bus was worth about $200. Charlie told him we'd paid just $1,000 for the VW bus, but would be happy to trade straight across. The man said it didn't make sense to him. $1,000 for $200. He worked at a local cannery and said he could really use the money, but with 6 kids, he needed his bus. So he invited us inside for coffee and to scan the phone book for bus retailers, and then for supper, and then to park for the night. The Van Deutsches became a part of our lives as we camped inside their bus for nearly a month while locating a small, retired yellow school bus, trading it for our VW, and refurbishing it in their backyard. Van and his 16-year-old son said that they hobbied at auto mechanics and proceeded to rebuild our entire engine. The rest of us gutted the insides, unbolted and removed the heavy seats, laid carpet remnants, and built a partition between the driver's area and the back, including a door for complete privacy. Evenings, we ate and sang with the family. Canned beans and country western mostly. And during that month, the younger kids began to argue with their mother about going to school. The teenagers talked about going with us, and the mother seemed ready, at times, to tell us to just go. Mary suffered pregnancy blues, and I suffered a miscarriage. I was fairly sure I had caused it. I'd had a blow-up with Charlie, during which I secretly wished that I wasn't pregnant. I'd cried on my way out of the bus, conspicuously reminiscent of leaving my father's house, then turned around, took off my shoes, and crawled into bed behind Mary. She'd kept quiet, but slid one of her hands behind her back into one of mine. That was how she consoled me, not with words, but with rare gestures that meant much more. I would find consolation for losing the baby only after learning that one of my grandmothers had had 4 miscarriages, in between 9 healthy children. It was a dry season in Sacramento. Work inside the bus was hot, and Mary and I were both irritable. But Patricia, the light-hearted, decided that we should sing. The latest to our entourage, Patty usually yielded to our moods, but damned if she didn't assert herself at times. In this case, dragging me kicking and snickering into a farcical opera. She and I were nailing down carpet at the back of the bus, while Mary worked at the front, hidden by the partition. Patty sang out, "Mary, we hear your hammer as you ding it. But don't say anything unless you sing it. For a moment, it seemed that our levity hadn't traveled, until we heard two descending tuba tones. Fuck you. Patty was the backup singer that Charlie had wanted, but she wasn't interested in solo work. Ever the compliment, she nudged and tugged the rest of us along. Mary might be the holdout, but physical hardships and recalcitrance were no match for the strength of her love. The Van Deutsches couldn't have been more hospitable, yet they were the poorest family I had ever met. Their poverty, however, had no effect on their fundamental character. The father was handsome, calm, steadfast, and strongly protective of his family. He drew lines, set an example, and had their respect. The mother, with her hands full, had let her body go. More than 100 pounds over a healthy weight, full of exasperation and complaint. She yelled at and swatted the kids. But they and her husband gave her purpose. Jealously, she clung to and wrestled her yoke. The 6 kids were bright-eyed, beautiful, full of unsophisticated wonder. Without the spoils of plenty, they were excited by small gifts and opportunities. Charlie gave the musically inclined 6-year-old a downsized guitar and taught him chords. Mary and I listened to the dreams of the oldest girl and made doing the dishes fun. But I couldn't leave this story without mentioning one of our questionable influences. Van's oldest son came to the bus one night and asked to try marijuana. Charlie warned that his father would be against it, but then he relented. When Van found out, he was ready to fight. I expected him to hit Charlie, but that didn't happen. Charlie talked him into coming inside the bus to smoke a joint so that he could at least speak with experience. To my knowledge, it was the only marijuana Van ever had, but the lasting result between him and Charlie was a funny and mellow piece. With their hospitality, the Van Deutsches gave us a rebuilt school bus and a view from inside a loving, hard-working family. I hope that we gave them more than troubles. We visited Peter DeLeo several times while we were in San Francisco, but we took a sharp detour after meeting his main girl, April. She was a beauty, with natural auburn hair and the freshness of a debutante. Pete was more than 20 years her senior, and attractive in only the way that confidence can be. But I figured they must need each other in the business. We girls questioned Charlie about Pete's business. He teased that he could get us jobs if we were so interested. The prospect was both exciting and repellent. The world's oldest profession perhaps always has been equally romanticized and shunned. After talking it over, we said we would like to see for ourselves. He questioned us further. Were we sure? We considered it an opportunity, and we were sure. You gotta have larceny in your heart to do this, Pete told me from one side of his mouth. You got larceny in your heart? I didn't know what the word meant, but I smiled and answered weakly in the affirmative. He sloughed off a laugh. He knew better, but we were available and worth a try. April was sisterly in preparing us for our first customer, who would arrive at the house in less than an hour. She helped us scrub, shave, perfume, and dress, while instructing us in the art of seductive foreplay that was, in reality, a check for venereal disease. She explained that our first customer would be having a party. Just him and the three of us. The man I'll call Roger was thick around the middle and reminded me of a friendly rhinoceros, but he was a lug. He lay on his back while the three of us worked on him like lifeguards. It became clear that he was prolonging the session, so we upped the persuasion, feigned ecstasy, and finally closed the deal. April, who discreetly took care of the financial dealings, had listened to us on the intercom. She was pleased. Each of us cleaned up in the bathroom. I was glad to be done with Roger, only to learn that I would be accompanying him on an all-night date. April gave me a short green evening dress and matching heels, and I was off on a whirlwind tour of middle-class bars. Roger told me that I would be meeting people, but he wouldn't tell me who I was supposed to be. Inside the first bar, he introduced me as Melanie Lane, his secretary, to a group of suited men who seemed jocularly unfooled by my title. At each of 3 bars, he introduced me to men. Then he and I perched on bar stools with highballs, pretending confidential conversation. Though 2 years below the drinking age, I was never carded. But not having had alcohol for months turned me giddy after the first gimlet. Soon, at my urging, we were whirling around a dance floor, me and Roger Rhinoceros. Later, a candlelit restaurant laid with red cloth napkins and tablecloths. We had oversized steaks with the fire marshal in an adjoining town. She looks young, doesn't she? Roger said, happily lifting a lock of my hair from my shoulder. But she is over 21. Roger might have been an attorney or an investigator. He had a police radio his car and discussed cases with his cohorts. He'd ask, "What's his name, honey?" And I'd look like I was thinking through my filing cabinets. Then he'd throw out a name, and I'd chirp, "That's it!" So went the ad-libs through the night. There were more drinks I couldn't finish, along with most of the steak. When we finally returned to our hotel room, Roger was chortling. "You did very well tonight," he said, leering at me. I lumbered into bed, nauseated, and not at all inclined to put up with his rhinoceros appendages. The next day, we drove back to Pete's house. Roger sang along with the radio. Getting to know you, getting to know all about you. I thought of the police radio. He told me he would see me again, that we would go golfing and bowling. I asked him where his wife lived. As soon as we got back to the house, I saw Charlie go in a side door, and I jumped out of the car with my shoes in my hand. This was not the life for me. Mary and Patty were not thrilled with it either. Contrary to April's assurances from her clients, Patty had been roughly treated. April was unapologetic. She rebuked Charlie for allowing himself to be seen coming into the house. She was furious that we had jeopardized her business simply so that we could have an experience. Moralizing about the way we were living, without structure or regard for money. She made a point that she was sending her 5-year-old daughter to a conservative Catholic school. Initially standing up on our behalf, Charlie chose instead to leave our share of the evening's earnings with April. We would later understand that she considered us spoiled because she had earned her way up in this business, starting at migrant flop houses, turning $10 tricks at roughly $10 an hour. Sexy Susan was a stripper in a San Francisco cabaret. Stretched on the Persian rug in a big Victorian house on Lion Street, propped on one elbow, she was barefoot and dressed in an orange sweatshirt and jeans, staring at Charlie, not saying a word. He was strumming his guitar and appeared unconscious of the 6 or 8 people who had gathered to listen. At least 4 people sublet rooms in the house. I spent some time talking with a thin blonde, rolling her short wavy hair in curlers. That was Ella, an experienced woman on break from college. She looked like a 1930s actress, with a bright smile as ready as her conversation. Susan felined through the room with theatrical confidence, glancing but not speaking. She reminded me of the girls called cheap in high school. The red, wispy hair at her shoulders, the dark brunette on top, the way her back arched and she walked breasts first. Yet, beneath a few slivers of bangs, was a face that looked almost holy, pale and subdued. The Lion Street residents were between jobs or tired of school, and they had run out of rent money. They asked Charlie if they could travel with us on the bus. He passed the question to us. Patty smiled and shrugged. Mary was prepared for it. And I felt, like each of them, that the decision wasn't mine. I left the establishment, Susan would say later, the moment I stepped on the bus in San Francisco. And I will never become a part of the establishment again. Mary or Charlie usually drove the bus by everyone's preference. The rest of us riding in back, feeling the wind through the open windows and the road beneath us. Susan opened up on the bus. She talked so much and laughed so loud, I reconsidered the prospects of living with her. There was a haunted loneliness about her that she covered with careless flippancy and daring with sly silences and brash bombast. Charlie chuckled, telling me that Susan was not crazy, but coming from another side. I thought she was embarrassing. She talked too much and said inappropriate things. She pushed herself to the center of attention, competing for anyone or anything at hand. When men were around, she waited to the side, watching for the best moment to come curling her tail, or if necessary, to pounce. It was rumored that Susan had watched her mother die in her arms and grew up on the far side of the tracks, experimenting with boys on brown grass beds. She said she'd been to prison for armed robbery with two guys on a joyride, that she hadn't done the robbery, she just waited in the car. She'd had an affair with a woman in prison, she said, and she seemed to hold that over us girls, like a degree in experience and a show of nerve. As we lay resting in the moving bus, having stayed up late the night before, I felt her hand on mine, alerting caution. But it was not a sneaking or lustful hand, only a hand that wanted to be accepted. So I did. And we lay quiet, listening to the rattles and rumbles of the bus, watching shapes of sunlight slide through the windows onto the ceiling. Not drugged, just relaxed, in touch and comfortable, like girls much younger, until we were both smiling conspiratorially, with no real secret but the feeling of being a secret together. Whenever we needed gas or a mechanic, Susan was the first volunteer to get it. She'd come back in a pickup truck, her body brushed against some bare, brawny arm, or in a station wagon, beside a goggle-eyed guy who was gulping and loosening his tie. As we scooted from the seat, she couldn't wait to tell us how perfectly it had happened. That was Susan's forte, to go out and get everything without necessarily having to give up anything. Charlie collaborated in showing her off, one time even asking her to go to Rio for a coconut. Without hesitation, without pausing to ask directions or pack a bag, she started for South America. Had he not stopped her? From collaboration, Susan advanced to competition. One night, as Charlie talked, she talked. I think it was her way of being him, but it looked like a challenge. She said exactly what he was saying, a fraction of a second behind him. He laughed and played it, tripping her up only a few times, and using the game to entertain visitors with stereophonic conversation. The challenge she had foisted fell away, and for the moment she loved him beyond herself. There was nothing she could do about it. Scattered along California's roads, streets, and highways, seekers of all generations were headed for the beaches, mountains, communes, and farms, for San Francisco, Monterey, Malibu, and Southeast Asia. no matter how light or high or blasé the times. The distant, ugly, unpopular war ran undercurrent to the common consciousness. Even those not contesting the war seemed to carry an uneasy responsibility. Charlie said that his responsibility began wherever he was. We picked up hitchhikers, pulling to the curb and opening the folding doors like a city bus. They were hippies, migrant workers, soldiers, and lots of runaways. A slight 14-year-old boy was coming south to see his brother after 4 months of travel. We asked how he avoided the cops. Like, if I'm on the street, he said, I might point to a hippie-looking lady and say, "That's my mom, officer," and they leave me alone. One time I was ready to run. The cop went up to this lady and I just knew she was gonna say, "I don't have a son." But she was cool. She looked at me and shook her head. Yes. And he just walked away. Plenty of kids had been kicked out, but few were expected to stay away. They were to beg back into their parents' favor or be punished by juvenile authorities. My mother is always miserable, a teenage girl told us, and she wants me to be like her. Charlie said that some parents hold on in reverse, fostering an ongoing conflict of misery and guilt from which their children rebel but can't escape. Did your parents seem to dislike you, yet want to depend upon them forever? Did they hold you down, pull your energy, and leave you to tears? And when you left, did they make you feel guilty? Do they think you belong to them, mind, body, and soul? Patricia Krenwinkel, 1970. A freckled runaway was sharp and blunt. My parents act like I'm the cause of all their problems. Now they can argue with each other. My father wanted all my attention. I was the object in a wicked game of vengeance with my mother, bounced across the table, and the center of every argument. And then my parents would say, "Where have we gone wrong?" Patricia Krenwinkel, 1970. Patty's parents held together until she was 17, after which she had ping-ponged across the country to be with each of them. She loved them, but had a healthy desire for independence. When we came along, she was self-motivated, self-supporting, and alone, even while sharing rent with her older sister. Patty's sister was involved in a dangerous lifestyle that Patty didn't share. Whether it was as easy as it appeared for her to leave Manhattan Beach, it almost certainly was essential to her well-being. Susan said she'd felt alone in her family since the age of 5. That's when her younger brother was born, and her parents were evidently clueless as to how to introduce him into the family. Her mother, she said, was always busy with the baby, while her father continued to do boy stuff with her older brother. She was not invited to join either of them. Rather than crying about it, She'd begun an emotionally independent life, challenging herself to do things that gave her a sense of accomplishment and identity. By the third grade, she'd said, I was the best shoplifter in the neighborhood. Charlie said that rebelliousness and destructive drives would be thought through and laid to rest in the mind. As much as I liked to consider him an ally against my own parents, he said he saw no reason for any of us to hold our parents in contempt. Our parents, he said, had done a good job in raising us to this very moment. If we blamed them, we'd have to blame their parents, and all the parents before them. And if we didn't blame them, we could more easily leave them behind. The socially irresponsible notion of walking away from our pasts was offset by the very real feeling that the present was all we could realistically be responsible for. Religious leaders will later point out to me that Jesus of Nazareth had done just that. It wasn't long before all male passengers but Charlie found reasons to depart, leaving him with 5 women. Each of us took on small tasks, and together were a pale river in which he swam. There was jealousy. It didn't manifest outwardly as much as within. A wretched, harrying wraith wringing twisted hands inside our chests, stifling breath and spirit. It wrestled each one of us, and sometimes got us down. Mary was so afflicted, she cried. The paradox was in Charlie's transparency. He could have been an ordinary philanderer or bigamist. He could have taken each of us separately and told us nothing of the others. He might have said, "Honey, I'll be on the road with my music, and if you want to do something for me and stick by me, you should get a job and an apartment and start putting money in the bank so we'll have something when I get back." He could have become an entertainer, a motivational speaker, a preacher, or any form of professional guru, and he could have had homes all over the country. Instead, he brought us together, witnessed our struggles, and sang. If I told you what I thought, would it change your opinion? If I told you how bright you are, could you make the change? How can one compete with the ocean? How can one compare with the sun? Road Song, Charles Manson, 1967. He had quit singing standardized music months before, preferring to explore music of the moment. It was a loss to me. Standard arrangements were a great vehicle for his voice, but his spontaneity was interesting. The words in music always changing, and even when the words were scat, he connected with his audience rhythmically, bobbing and tapping, his face animate. He was a natural entertainer, but I think the conscientious objection kept him from an entertainment career. He said, "Soul in music is the expression of feeling, not an act of entertainment." I bogged down in self-criticism. He encouraged us seriously. Don't get down on yourself for getting down on yourself. We each do what we do because that's what we know to do. And humorously, learning to walk doesn't start with the first step. One must first stand. Walking doesn't work well unless one stands. You say how nice it is to offer someone the best, and that is a nice thought illusion. But if you play best, then there must be a worst. You would probably feel ashamed of me if I took a booger out of my nose and put it on the Queen of England's hat. And if I gave you a piece of candy with hair, sand, dirt, and tobacco in it, you could wrinkle up your nose and say, "I take only the best." All that is. So we can play whatever. But we wink in knowing the universe has always been perfect. I don't know how to make the universe any better. Do you? Charles Manson, circa 1973. Letter to Lynn. He offered new views, new moves, and basic problem solving. If it doesn't work one way, try another. One time he told us a riddle. I call it an impossible situation, or how to play chess. The captives of a conquering army were brought in succession before its king, and asked why they should not be put to death. One man replied that he was but a lowly rug maker. "I will spare your life for one deed," said the king. "Make me a rug to cover my entire kingdom. You have until sunrise." Thus dismissed, the condemned man was confined to ponder his fate. The rug maker would survive. What did he do? I'll give you the answer if you don't know. I never solved these riddles, but I loved that they made us figure. He didn't claim to have invented them. He said he was telling us what others had told him. That was important. He acknowledged others' words and work. It wasn't flattery, and it wasn't gratuitous. Everyone over the age of 5 knows the difference. I believe he'd seen people steal credit for other people's work, and that, to him, a boss stealing credit for ideas and accomplishments of employees would have been worse than stealing their worldly goods. His attitude bulldozed mental debris that had me stuck in yesterday. He said that he, himself, started over each day as if he'd never lived the day before. And in answer to that riddle, he said that the rug maker made the king a pair of shoes. Recognition of truth is instant. It may grab you, stun you, inform, or make you laugh. You want to see or hear it or read it again. It's a gift, and you're grateful. That's what Charlie was to us. Words were meaningful to him. He once asked me, "Do you know how to keep from breaking promises?" And when I didn't respond, he said, "Don't make them." It was so simple. He could talk in ways only understood by his target audience. The rare times I heard him make references to this, he called it talking on the down low. It was a dodge of old outlaws and prisoners, and he was unconsciously fluent in it. He also communicated indirectly. One time in Sacramento, he chastened me in front of Peter DeLeo for something I hadn't done. Later, he told me he'd been talking through me to Pete. He said, if it doesn't apply, pay it no mind. So, on the one hand, he acknowledged our works and our efforts, but on the other, he didn't coddle our egos. Once, after he lauded the feminine aspects of life, he said, "What makes you think I was talking about your little personality? My woman is the earth." The ambivalence I had perceived in Charlie's view of women was not limited to two sides. As with men, he apparently had views from all women he had met, and he portrayed them, from the society gossips who begged, "Oh, do tell," to the nannies and servants who took care of their children. He didn't do imitations, but reverberations, and only in the context of the time and place and persons to whom he was speaking. Of servants, he said they were always more aware than the people they serve, and the real master is the best servant. He knew country women. Whether describing his relatives or others, he didn't say. But in many ways, his written description reminds me of my own country grandmother. She was up at the sun and put fire in the stove, grabbed a bucket and was off to the barn, milked and fed the cows, come back and put a meal on the table, homemade butter and bread, little if any store-bought food, and I mean a meal. Then she slopped the hogs, fed chickens, turkeys, rabbits, got dressed for Sunday school, went to church, came home at 11, and at 12 or 1 had another meal on the table for 6 people. Tops the best. She put on 3 a day and worked 17 hours a day to make ends meet. With little money, everything they needed, they raised or grew themselves. Not a nail or board would go to waste. Not a rag or string got trashed. In fact, the trash was little, for everything was used and reused. There wasn't no scotch tape or paper clips, staples or ballpoints, no plastic, no waste. There was good, honest, and not even a thought about it or known the difference. I've watched the progression of women from wagons to spaceships, from no smoking or bad words, and I don't know if it's progress or decline. I guess it all depends on what's wanted. What's the goal and reason? I was never schooled into judgments of it. Charles Manson, circa 1984, letter from prison. In the days of living closely together, we girls rebuffed, mirrored, and embraced each other, exchanging random thoughts and discovering that many of our unconscious thoughts worked against us. It was easy to see that if our minds had to climb over a clutter of negatives to access intuitive knowledge, our energy and potential was wasted. While now commonly understood, those introspections were new to us. We realized that we had accepted ideas about ourselves and the world as we toddled out of self-centeredness and learned to live in the thoughts of adults. We mimicked them and fit into our advantage. But we also had languished in their unconscious limitations of themselves. Superficially, we called it negative programming or brainwashing, and it was roundly agreed that our brains could benefit from another washing. The bus was a camp with sleeping bags and a Coleman stove. It was a modern cushioned living room, a chic's lair, a think tank, a space capsule, whatever we wanted or needed. Tripping was therapeutic. Like psychotherapy, psychedelics provide inside info. The so-called hallucinations, not mere distortions of the senses, but dreamlike states revealing subconscious thought in both a tactile and attached way. We didn't stop to fear these substances, but would learn to respect their potency and limit use. Not all visions were pleasant. Charlie advised us to watch them pass without judgment. In my experience, the more natural the setting, the more universal the understandings, and accessible the peace. About that time, the Beatles debuted a new album. They sang that the Magical Mystery Tour was dying to take us away. Death and dying took on new meanings. Someone aptly described a common psychedelic experience as the poignant sensation of life's resilience and its fragility, of its humor and sadness all at once. It blew our minds and brought us to the living present, an awareness common to the terminally ill, but who, after all, is not terminal. Rational people who have concluded psychedelics to be nothing more than the drug-induced insanity, unworthy of further study, might consider that sleep triggers the same fall into sub-realities, some more bizarre than we could consciously imagine. All the exact measurements and perfect formulas in the world do not explain dreaming, birth, death, or infinity. The realization that there is no end to the sky that surrounds us can be shocking. For those comforted by maxims and finite figures, the thought of infinity is completely insane. Charlie said that the soul doesn't die or grow old. He didn't say that the bodies would last forever, but we came to believe that we could die in thought, so that spirit could live through our bodies for as long as we had them. Most of us got our glimpses into this reality, but any attempt to capture and hold it erased the experience. We awoke from dreams of profound illumination, knowing nothing but fleeting images and feelings. Beyond gradual understandings of our individual selves, and perhaps those of our ancestors, was a larger and lasting consciousness of oneness with all life. In that thought, we opened our minds to the discovery of intelligence and communication from every living thing. People communicate on levels beneath their own awareness. Charlie said that if we looked, we could see their communications in their eyes, their facial expressions, the movements of their hands and bodies. His understanding surfaced as both a courtesy and a self-protection. One day, he told us that our sense of freedom frightened some people, and that our happiness made unhappy people uncomfortable. People who can't dance and sing don't want to see other people dancing and singing unless it's on the radio or TV, because it reminds them they're stuck. Those of us gleefully shedding inhibitions felt entitled to celebrate. But his read of other people seemed to produce in him both empathy and caution. It was more considerate and also wise at times to dim our enthusiasm. He called it playing under. As for the loudly touted ideal of freedom, he was a realist. Once, as I watched a soaring seagull, he said to me, "You think that bird is free, but it's dictated by cold, heat, rain, and some days it don't eat." In those days, it was common to see buses and vans parked on the sides of roads so that the occupants could see the sights or sleep for a night, nibbling raisins from workers behind a packing plant, or dining on camp grub overlooking the ocean. The thrill of travel and the beauty of California got into us. On massive breakwater cliffs beside Monterey Bay, wind-bent branches appeared to conduct sunset symphonies. Once a whaling town, Monterey was still home to a few scrimshaw artists carving tiny tableaux on whalebone. Locals said that at the turn of the century, those shores had been heaped 15 feet high with whale bones, and a few might still be found. Most of us had never seen a whale, in whole or in part, except in books. Seated on the carpet after a meal, Charlie said that living with a harem was the stuff of prisoners' dreams. Then he added, "But it's not fair to you." We women smiled at each other, shrugging. He explained that his energy was limited, after which he was cheating us of both companionship and sexual love. He asked, "Where are all the guys?" and concluded, "They must be in prison or at war." He said we should think about it. Why would he want the complications of more men? Some of the girls may have liked the idea, but I think all of us wanted to be with him. Was his suggestion a tactical intention to recruit a malleable following? Was he plotting, even then, to send an army of young people against the establishment? The bus was stopped by curious police and cited for its color. I think we got 2 traffic tickets for that. The salesman hadn't told us that, although the name of the school district had been removed. The yellow bus was legally still a school bus and could not be privately operated as such. We would have to paint it. About that time, we met Tony and Poncho. They were coming out of a house in one of the run-down suburbs of LA. But it was the choppers that first caught Charlie's attention. Custom motorcycles with high handlebars and long front ends. He got out of the bus to talk to their owners. Tony could have been a Pachuco, but he wasn't Mexican. Blonde, green-eyed, muscular but lean. He was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt under a plaid wool Pendleton. His mustache curled at the corners, and he had small, straight teeth that showed when he saw 5 girls looking out of the windows of a bus at him. His best buddy, Poncho, was also cute, but short, copper-colored, and 4-legged. A corgi. Tony took us inside the house where his biker buddies milled around, and one svelte young woman in curlers was putting on makeup, getting ready for work. After hearing our story, some of the bikers volunteered to paint the bus. The resulting beer-fueled extravaganza of provocative graffiti would have brought an endless chain of police. So we diplomatically blacked the whole thing, inside and out. Unfortunately for Tony, the motorcycles around the house belonged to his friends. His bike was in pieces, literally a wreck, and he didn't have the money for another one. Furthermore, rent on the house had expired. Everyone had to move. Charlie asked Tony if he'd ever driven a bus. He hesitated, but the outcome was predictable. Poncho jumped onto the box heater inside the driver's window as Tony sat down in the seat. It was a good fit. By his smile, we knew he would agree. Tony and Charlie spent the next several hundred miles talking guy stuff, generally apart from us women. Every day, dynamics in the bus changed, but rather than feeling excluded, we girls lit with feminine energy. Tony was quiet, with a dry sense of humor. Wherever he went, he attracted female attention. But he wasn't one to make the first move with a woman, and seemed clueless as to what to do with 5. Charlie, goofing around in the back of the bus, took my hand as he was talking to Tony, laid me down, and mischievously pretended that I was the motorcycle. He half-stripped me, carefully examined and polished my parts, made sure that I was successfully oiled, and set about turning on my ignition, all while talking like he was checking out a new ride. He didn't do much more than rev me up, but I think he succeeded in showing Tony that we were no more difficult and no less fun than motorcycles. We decorated and accessorized the bus a la hermit crab. Someone gave us the bleached skull of a goat that we mounted on the grill, and a friend built us a box about the size of a coffin to hold a water tank on the roof. In Sacramento, Peter DeLeo introduced us to a candy man, who loaded that box with every shape and flavor of his goods. And later, in San Francisco, while checking the load, Charlie and Tony tossed packages of candy down to passerby, like beads at Mardi Gras. Speaking of beads, I don't remember any of us wearing them. We were too active for beads. And we didn't say groovy either. We did say wow a lot. Charlie said that the rest of us picked up. All is one. It's always now. They made as much sense as the rest of the world. He said there was no time, and no death, and no such thing as no such thing. He asked, "Is there anything new? Does the earth weigh more than it did 100,000 years ago?" Charlie. Nothing ended. Nothing began. People say end, but that only means one change moving into another. The ball begins to bounce. It stops bouncing and begins to roll. It stops rolling and begins to decay. It stops rotting and blows away. Hitchhikers asked us, "Where are you going?" We said, "Nowhere." They asked, "Where are you coming from?" We laughed, "Nowhere." They asked, "Well, what are you doing?" And of course, we said, "Nothing." explaining that we were doing whatever was happening in the moment, being at home when the soul calls, touring the planet, group therapy, whatever struck our fancy. And people asked, "How do you live?" We said, "Good. We give everything away, and we still have everything." So one day, a miserable, malingering college boy stated, "I want the bus." We said, "You have the bus. You're on it." But he said, "You say you give everything away. I want the bus, and I want you all to leave." We were stunned. Charlie asked, "Do you really want to do that to yourself?" He did. So without further comment, everyone got a change of clothes and left the bus. We decided on a meeting place and hitchhiked in pairs to Malibu, where we resorted on a balmy beach under a bridge. By the time all had arrived, we'd found a wooden house across the highway, in a flowery hollow, down a sandy lane, and up a spiral staircase. A house reputedly donated by an older hippie chick to be left open to whoever needs it.